Detroit, October 1942. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal factory floor roared like a giant metallic organism. The air was thick with the smell of welding arcs, machine oil, and human sweat. On the relentless assembly line, hundreds of workers assembled the hulls of M4 Sherman tanks, the very machines meant to bring victory to the Allies in North Africa. Joe Miller, a 40-year-old welder, stood at his station, his torch tracing steady seams along steel plates. Every spark reminded him of the artillery flashes his younger brother Tommy described in his letters. Just 3 months ago, Tommy, a cheerful 20-year-old kid from an Ohio farm, had volunteered for the Armored Corps. "The German guns cut through our armor like tin cans," Tommy had written in his last letter, which Joe had read until the paper was soft and worn. Those words haunted Joe every night, mingling with nightmares of his brother burning inside a stricken Sherman. Suddenly, the roar of the factory died into an unnatural silence. The conveyor belt ground to a halt. Foreman Henry Edwards stood at the entrance to the bay, his face pale and strained. "Everyone, listen up!" His voice cut through the quiet, but it trembled. "We've just received word. Our sister plant in Michigan has been hit by sabotage. 2 workers are dead, 20 more injured." A murmur went through the workforce. Joe felt his hands go cold. He looked at the photograph of Tommy pinned to his workstation. A sudden, irrational fear gripped him. What if this wasn't sabotage? What if it was a warning? Foreman Edwards walked over to Joe's station, his expression unreadable. He didn't meet Joe's eyes. "Miller, the office wants to see you. Now." The walk to the administrative wing felt endless. The silence was deafening, broken only by the echo of his own boots on the concrete. He thought of Tommy's smile, of their mother, of the last time they'd gone fishing together. The office door was ajar. Inside, the plant manager sat behind a large desk, a single stark piece of paper lying in front of him. Joe didn't need to read it. He knew. The official War Department telegram. The words, "We regret to inform you," seemed to burn through the page before he even picked it up. His brother, his little Tommy, was gone. Killed in action. Another Sherman, another tin can, torn apart by a German shell. That night, Joe sat alone in his dimly lit apartment. Tommy's final letter lay open on the table, next to a half-empty bottle of whiskey. He drank not to forget, but to feel something other than the crushing guilt. He was here, safe, building the coffins that sent boys like his brother to their graves. The whiskey burned its way down, and a desperate, crazy idea began to form in the fog of his grief. It was a thought born of anger, of loss, and of a single burning question. What if the armor itself was wrong? The whiskey bottle was empty. The grief had not subsided, but it had transformed. It was now a cold, hard knot in Joe Miller's stomach, a relentless engine of despair and furious purpose. He looked at the clock. 11:45 p.m. His shift started at midnight. He stood up, his movements deliberate, and walked to the small closet where he kept his work clothes. He didn't bother changing out of the ones he'd been drinking in. The factory at night was a different beast. The frantic daytime energy was gone, replaced by a grim, industrial determination. The shadows were longer, the noises more isolated and ominous. Joe clocked in, the sound echoing in the near-empty locker room. His head throbbed, but his hands were steady. He took his position at the welding station. The half-assembled hull of a Sherman sat before him, a monstrous, angular skeleton waiting for its skin. The next task was to weld the front glacis plate, a critical piece of armor meant to deflect enemy fire. The blueprint called for it to be mounted at a 56-degree angle, standard, approved. The same angle on every single Sherman that rolled off the line. Joe picked up his welding torch, the familiar weight feeling foreign in his hand. He ignited it, the blue flame hissing to life. He stared at the steel plate, then at the hull. Tommy's words echoed in his mind, louder than the factory's hum. Like tin cans. A reckless thought, fueled by grief and alcohol, took hold. What if the angle was wrong? What if the manuals, the engineers, everyone was wrong? He remembered skipping flat stones on the lake with Tommy when they were kids. The angle was everything. Too steep, and it sank. Too shallow, and it skipped. With a grunt, he pushed the heavy plate. Instead of the prescribed 56 degrees, He forced it to a much shallower, more radical angle. It looked wrong. It looked absurd, like a slouching hat on the tank's nose. It violated every specification, every diagram he'd ever been taught. His foreman, Henry Edwards, a man built like a bulldog with a permanent frown, was making his rounds. He stopped dead when he saw Joe's work, his face flushed with instant anger. "Miller, what in God's name are you doing?" he bellowed, storming over. "Are you drunk? That's not the spec. That's not anything. You've ruined the whole assembly." Joe didn't look up. "The spec gets boys killed, Henry." "That's not your job to decide," Edwards shot back, his voice a low, furious growl. "Your job is to follow the damn blueprint. We have a war to win. We don't have time for your drunken experiments." He pointed a shaking finger at the malformed hull. "You're done. Finished. Get out of my sight. Don't even clean up. Report to the manager's office first thing in the morning. You're fired." Edwards stormed off, radioing for a cleanup crew to deal with the defective hull. Joe stood there for a moment, staring at his creation. It looked like a monstrous mistake. He felt a wave of shame and certainty. He had thrown away his job, his dignity, for a drunkard's hunch. He turned and walked away, leaving the strangely angled tank hull behind him, a silent monument to his failure and his loss. He was sure he would never set foot in the factory again. The morning sun streamed into the factory manager's office, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Joe Miller sat stiffly in a wooden chair, facing the manager, Mr. Peterson, and a furious foreman, Edwards. The dismissal papers lay on the desk between them. "Your record was spotless, Miller," Peterson said, his voice heavy with disappointment. 20 years, and you throw it all away on one night of drunken negligence. We're building tanks, not abstract sculptures." Before Joe could respond, a young man in his late 20s wearing engineer's coveralls and holding a clipboard burst into the office without knocking. It was Frank Lowell, a recent MIT graduate and one of the plant's junior design engineers. His eyes were wide with excitement, ignoring the tense scene. "Mr. Peterson, you have to see this," Frank exclaimed, his words tumbling out. "The ballistic test, the one scheduled for this morning, they used that hull from Bay 4, the defective one from last night." Edwards scowled. "What about it? Did it shatter?" "I want that scrap melted down immediately." "That's just it, sir," Frank said, struggling to contain his excitement. "It didn't. They fired a 37mm AP round at it. Standard test. At 200 yards. It ricocheted. Cleanly. It didn't even crack the weld." A stunned silence filled the room. Peterson leaned forward. "A ricochet? From that angle? That's statistically improbable." "Impossible, according to our current models," Frank corrected him, tapping his clipboard. "But the data doesn't lie. The shallow angle Miller created deflected the round. The energy distribution was completely different. It wasn't a fluke. They fired 3 more rounds. Same result." All eyes turned to Joe. The shame on his face had been replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. His drunken, grief-stricken hunch hadn't been a mistake. It had been a discovery. Frank turned to Joe, his expression one of pure scientific curiosity. "Miller, what were you thinking? What was the principle?" Joe cleared his throat, his voice rough. My brother. He wrote me. Said our armor was like paper. I thought about skipping stones on a lake. You need a shallow angle." Edwards snorted. "Skipping stones? This is a multi-million-dollar war program, not a childhood pastime." "But he's right," Frank interjected, his engineer's mind seizing the concept. "He's describing the basic physics of oblique impact. We've been designing armor to be thick, not smart. We've been trying to stop the shell through mass alone. He found a way to make it miss entirely." Peterson stared at the dismissal papers on his desk. He slowly picked them up, and with a deliberate tear, ripped them in half. He looked at Joe, then at Frank. "Lowell," Peterson said, his voice now sharp and decisive, "you have a new assignment. Take Miller. Take that hull. I want a full report. I want tests against 50mm and 75mm. I want stress analysis. You have 48 hours. You just officially became my most important and most secret R&D team." Joe sat back, the reality of the situation washing over him. He wasn't fired. He was, against all odds, being given a chance. The crazy idea born from a bottle of whiskey and a broken heart was now the focus of the entire plant. The war for Joe Miller had just taken a very personal turn. A secluded corner of the arsenal, once used for storing obsolete machinery, became their laboratory. The defective hull stood at its center, a silent rebel. For Joe Miller and Frank Lowell, the next 48 hours were a blur of frantic, clandestine activity. Frank was the theorist, his mind alight with equations and stress distribution charts. Joe was the practical hand, his decades of experience telling him what the metal could and couldn't do. They worked in a bubble of intense focus, shielded from the main production line by Peterson's direct orders. Frank would calculate a new, more radical angle on his slide rule, his hands trembling with excitement. Joe, if we increase the obliquity to 65 degrees, the effective thickness increases by almost 40% without adding a single pound of steel. Joe would then translate those numbers into reality, his torch now wielded with precision, not despair. He carefully cut and re-welded plates, creating a hybrid hull that looked like nothing in any military manual. It was a patchwork of aggressive, sloping angles. The official testers, a grizzled crew of ex-military ballistics experts, were initially skeptical. "You're wasting good ammunition on this modern art project, Lowell," the chief tester, a man named O'Malley, grumbled as they set up the 50mm anti-tank gun. The first shot rang out, a direct hit. The sound was different this time, not the sickening crunch of penetrated steel, but a high-pitched scree as the armor-piercing round gouged a deep furrow across the plate and ricocheted harmlessly into the earthworks. O'Malley lowered his binoculars, his skepticism replaced by professional curiosity. Again, they fired the 75mm, the gun that had killed so many Shermans in the desert. The impact was thunderous, shaking the hull on its blocks. A web of cracks appeared around the weld, but the plate held. The shell had shattered, its energy dissipated across the sloped surface. It was a partial penetration, but not a catastrophic kill. Frank rushed forward, inspecting the damage. "The weld failed, not the principle. Joe, we need to reinforce the joint here and here." Joe was already there, his experienced eye seeing the weakness. "The stress is concentrating. We need a different bevel. Channel the force away." They worked through the night, reinforcing, adjusting, perfecting. It was no longer just about proving a point. It was about saving lives. Joe wasn't just welding steel. He was welding his brother's legacy into every seam. With each spark, he felt a small piece of his grief turn into determination. By dawn, they had a revised prototype. O'Malley and his team returned, their earlier cynicism gone. The final test was against a captured German 80mm round, the most feared tank killer on the battlefield. The gun roared. The impact was deafening. When the smoke cleared, the plate was deeply dented, the weld holding by a thread. But it had held. The 88 had failed to achieve a clean penetration. An awed silence fell over the testing range. O'Malley walked up to the hull and ran his hand over the scarred, sloped armor. He turned to Joe and Frank, a new respect in his eyes. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I've seen 100 hulls fail that test. You've just built the toughest damn Sherman I've ever laid eyes on." The crazy idea was no longer crazy. It was a breakthrough. The secret project was ready for its final, most difficult test, convincing the War Department. The conference room in the Pentagon was a world away from the oily, familiar chaos of the Detroit factory. Joe Miller, in a painfully stiff suit, stood beside Frank Lowell, who was nervously arranging his charts and graphs. Across the polished mahogany table sat a board of senior military officials and War Department bureaucrats. The air was thick with cigar smoke and skepticism. Frank presented their findings with scientific precision, showing the ballistic data, the photographs of ricocheted rounds, the calculations of increased effective armor. He spoke of oblique impact physics and stress distribution. When he finished, an elderly, stern-faced general named Braxton, a man who had built his career on established doctrine, leaned forward. He ignored Frank and fixed his cold gaze on Joe. "Let me understand this," the general said, his voice like grinding gravel. The entire armored strategy of the United States Army should be revised. Because a factory welder had a drunken dream about skipping stones? A few of the other officers smirked. Joe felt his face grow hot, but he held the general's stare. "No, sir," Joe said, his voice low but clear. "It should be revised because the current strategy is getting my brother, and thousands like him, killed in tin cans." The room went silent. The general's eyes narrowed. "Sentiment does not win wars, Mr. Miller. Production does. Logistics do. Your angled armor would require a complete retooling of our assembly lines. It would slow production to a crawl. We are winning this war through volume, through drowning the enemy in a tide of Shermans. 5 adequate tanks now are worth 1 perfect tank 6 months from now." A colonel from the Ordnance Department nodded in agreement. "The general is correct. The M4's design is finalized. The tooling is in place across a dozen factories. What you're proposing would cost millions and delay our offensive capabilities by a year at least." "We cannot stop the conveyor belt for a theory," Frank tried to interject. "But the survival rate for our tank crews is a calculated risk," the general interrupted, his tone final. "The modification is rejected. The M4 will continue to be produced to existing specifications. This meeting is adjourned." The officials stood and began filing out. Joe and Frank were left standing alone in the vast, opulent room, their hopes shattered. The data, the proof, the lives it could save. None of it had mattered in the face of cold, hard production numbers. Frank slumped into a chair, running his hands through his hair. "It's over. They didn't even listen." Joe stood rigid, watching the empty doorway. He thought of Tommy and of all the other boys in their adequate tanks. The determination that had been forged in the factory fires of Detroit hardened into something unbreakable. "No," Joe said, his voice quiet but iron strong. "It's not over. They won't change the Army, so we'll change it ourselves." Back in Detroit, defeat was not an option. Joe Miller and Frank Lowell became men possessed. If the War Department wouldn't authorize the change, they would implement it by stealth. Their secret project moved from the isolated warehouse to the very heart of the production line, operating under the guise of efficiency improvements and weld quality tests. Frank, using his authority as an engineer, began subtly altering the blueprints that went to the factory floor. A 56-degree angle became 58, then 60. He made the changes incrementally, buried in technical drawing revisions, hoping the cumulative effect would go unnoticed by overworked inspectors. Joe was the field general of this quiet rebellion. He moved from station to station, teaching his trusted fellow welders a new technique. A slight, almost imperceptible adjustment in how they held the torch. A way to encourage the plate to sit just a little bit shallower. He didn't preach physics. He spoke their language. "Makes for a cleaner seam," he'd say. "Less stress on the joint. She'll hold better." He was selling a lie wrapped in a truth, and his reputation lent it credibility. They focused their efforts on the most critical areas, the front glacis plate and the turret mantlet. Tank after tank began rolling off the line, each one slightly different from the official specifications, each one carrying a hidden advantage. They were creating a shadow fleet of Shermans, their secret woven into the very fabric of the armor. The risk was enormous. Discovery meant court-martial for Frank and certain imprisonment for Joe. Foreman Edwards, while no longer openly hostile, watched them with a wary eye. He saw the subtle changes but said nothing, the memory of the ballistic test results perhaps staying his hand. The first real test of their clandestine operation came not from the military police, but from the battlefield. A letter arrived for Joe, not from his brother, but from a Sergeant William Peters of the 3rd Armored Division. One of their modified tanks had taken a direct hit from a German K-40 anti-tank gun. The letter described the miracle. The shell had screeched across the front plate, leaving a terrible scar, but failing to penetrate. The crew had survived. Sergeant Peters ended his letter with a question that struck Joe to his core. "I don't know what you did different on our Sherman, but it saved our lives. Whatever it is, keep doing it." Joe showed the letter to Frank. They stood in silence, the weight of their actions finally feeling real. They weren't just bending rules. They were saving lives, one unauthorized weld at a time. The conveyor belt continued to move, but now it carried not just tanks, but hope, a secret whispered in steel, on its way to the front lines. The war ended. The thunder of the Detroit factories faded to a memory. Joe Miller never received a medal. There was no official ceremony, no citation in the Army records for the welder who redesigned the Sherman tank. The modifications he and Frank Lowell had smuggled into production remained a quiet, unwritten chapter in the history of the war, known only to the crews who owed their lives to them and the men who had built them. Frank Lowell went on to have a distinguished career as an automotive engineer, the principles of slopped armor he'd helped pioneer becoming standard in post-war tank design. But he always credited the breakthrough to a grieving welder and a moment of drunken inspiration. Joe returned to the familiar rhythm of peacetime work, the ghost of his brother finally at rest. One autumn afternoon, years later, he was visiting a war memorial with his young grandson. The boy pointed at a displayed Sherman tank, its lines now iconic. "Did you build tanks, Grandpa?" the boy asked. Joe looked at the familiar hull, his eyes tracing the subtle, critical angle of the front plate. His angle. He saw not just steel, but the ghost of his brother's smile, the frantic nights with Frank, the silent conspiracy on the assembly line, and the letter from a sergeant whose name he'd never know. He put a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "I welded," Joe said simply, his voice soft with memory. "Just tried to make the seam strong." He never spoke of the secret modifications again. But in tank museums and history books, the later model Shermans, with their improved survivability, stood as silent testament to his legacy. It was a legacy not of fame, but of countless unnamed soldiers who came home. Men who never knew that their survival hinged on a drunk welder's crazy idea, a skipped stone on the water, and a brother's love that refused to accept the world as it was. The conveyor belt had long since stopped, but the echo of his welder's torch continued to ring through history, a quiet, enduring note of defiance and hope.